Goose step, Wikipedia audio. The goose step is a special marching step performed on formal military parades and other ceremonies. While marching in parade formation, troops swing their legs in unison off the ground while keeping each leg straight and unbent. The step originated in Prussian military drill in the mid-18th century and was called the Stechschritt or Stechmarsch. German military advisors spread the tradition to Russia in the 19th century, and the Soviets spread it around the world in the 20th. The goose step is now used by the militaries of over 70 countries, comprising 3/5 of the world's population. The term goose step originally referred to a British military drill in which one leg at a time was swung back and forth without bending the knee. Apparently, standing on only one leg reminded soldiers of how geese often stand. The term was later applied to the German Stechschritt during World War I and is nowadays heavily associated with Nazi Germany. As a result, term has acquired a pejorative meaning in some English-speaking countries. Ceremonial usage. The goose step is a difficult marching style that takes much practice and coordination. It is therefore reserved for ceremonial occasions. Goose stepping is often seen in military parades. Because it is difficult to maintain for long periods of time, troops only begin to goose step when they approach the reviewing stand and return to a normal march step once they have marched past. Large military parades require several days of practice to ensure that troops can perform the goose step without injuring themselves. Preparatory training includes having soldiers march in small groups, with arms linked to maintain balance. Argentina, the infantry company of the Colegio Militar de la Nación uses the goose step as their parade step. Other units perform the high step. Bolivia practices the waist-high form of goose stepping in military parades. Chile uses the Prussian form of the goose step essentially unaltered. Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador uses a waist-high goose step in military parades. El Salvador, Haiti, the Haitian military was dissolved in 1996. However, demobilized soldiers have formed militias that continue to drill with the goose step. The government began reforming its armed forces in 2016, sending them to be trained by Latin American countries that use the goose step like Ecuador. Thus, the new Haiti Defense Force marches in like manner as in many South and Central American armed services which use the practice. Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay. In military parades, troops march with a waist-high goose step at the quick step. Peru, Venezuela. Honor guards also use the goose step during solemn ceremonies such as at war memorials or military cemeteries. The goose step has been featured in several Olympic opening ceremonies, as the host nation pays the same respect to the Olympic flag as to its own flag. In the most rigorous form of the goose step, often found in guard mounting ceremonies, the pace is done at a slow march, and the leg is nearly horizontal, and sometimes well beyond. In a standard goose step, found in large military parades, the pace is done at a quick march and the leg is raised only to knee height, or even to calf height. The lower goose step improves balance and unit cohesion at the tempo of a quick march. Flag bearers and honor guards will frequently march with a higher goose step than the mass of troops following. The Stechschritt originated in the 18th century, like other march steps, as a method of keeping troops lined up properly as they advanced towards enemy lines. It was introduced into German military tradition by Leopold I, Prince of Anhalt-Dessau, a field marshal whose close attention to training transformed the Prussian infantry into one of the most formidable armed forces in Europe. Other armies adopted different march steps that served the same purpose. In the British Army, soldiers were trained to swing their arms in a wide arc to allow officers to keep the advancing line in order. The Russian Empire adopted the goose step during the 1796–1801 reign of Paul I. By the mid-19th century, the replacement of muskets with rifles greatly increased the accuracy of defensive fire. It was too hazardous to march forward into battle in precise formation, and the practice became obsolete. However, armed forces continued to drill recruits in marching techniques that now focus on team building, military uniformity, and ceremonial functions. This was true in Prussia and the later German Empire, where the goose step became emblematic of military discipline and efficiency. The goose step became widespread in militaries around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. Military modernization and political influence carried the practice to Asia, Africa, and Latin America from its origins in Prussia and Russia. Albania, Belarus, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, a mild form of the goose step is performed by honor guards, with the foot raised only a few centimeters off the ground. It is not found at military parades, however. Estonia, only color guards goose step in quick time during military ceremonies and parades. Hungary, only color guards goose step in slow time during military ceremonies. Latvia, only selected guards goose step in ceremonial purposes. Moldova, Poland, only honor guards, color guards, and cadets perform the goose step in military parades and other ceremonies. Russia, Slovakia uses the goose step as a general parade step only by honor guards. Spain uses the goose step as a slow march for the most important ceremonies, such as royal funerals and the presentation of the colors. The goose step is not used for military parades or guard mounting ceremonies. Ukraine. The first wave of adoption took place in the late 19th century, as the Prussian army became greatly admired for its decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War. This led many countries to modernize their military forces along the Prussian model. The Chilean army was the first non-European country to adopt the goose step, importing many Prussian military traditions after the War of the Pacific. The practice of goose stepping then spread widely throughout Latin America thanks to Chilean and Prussian influence. Goose stepping continued to gain ground even after Germany's defeat in World War I, as many nations still looked to the German model for military organization and training. Notably, the Army of Nationalist China was trained by German advisors in the 1920s, accounting for the largest single goose-stepping military today. Algeria, Angola uses the goose step as a general parade step. The MPLA was supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba during the Angolan War of Independence. Benin, Burkina Faso uses the goose step as a special march step for military bands and commando units. Other units do not goose step. Burundi uses the goose step as a general parade step. Burundi was formerly part of German East Africa. Cameroon was a German colony prior to World War I. Chad, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Republic of the Congo, Djibouti. At military parades, a horizontal goose step is performed at a slow march. Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Ghana includes the western half of the former German colony of Togoland. Only the Ghanaian Special Forces use the goose step in military parades. Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Mauritania, Mozambique, Namibia was formerly known as German Southwest Africa. When the country became independent from apartheid South Africa in 1990, it kept the British-style march step. However, it has since returned to the traditional goose step. Rwanda uses a horizontal goose step for military parades. Rwanda was formerly part of German East Africa, and the rebels who won the Rwandan Civil War received their military training in the goose-stepping country of Uganda, Senegal, Seychelles. Tanzania includes most of the former German East Africa. The country was aligned with the socialist side during the Cold War, and its military received training from East Germany. At military parades, a horizontal goose step is performed at a quick march. Togo comprises the eastern half of the former German colony of Togoland. Togo now uses the goose step as a general parade step, performed at a slow march. Uganda. History. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union trained the military forces of many of its client states with Soviet military drill and ceremonial practices. This led to the second great wave of adoption, as the goose step was introduced into many Third World countries in Asia and Africa. Meanwhile, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom were through its efforts in its client republics and allies preventing the use of the goose step in their armed services. A divided Germany was also divided in the goose step. The East German National Volksarmee kept the goose step, while the West German Bundeswehr adopted an Western-style march step but with hands swinging. The centuries-long German practice of goose-stepping finally ended in 1990, when the East German Army also ended the practice altogether. The goose step is a feature of military ceremonies in dozens of countries, to varying extents. Some countries use the goose step as a general parade step performed by all troops, while others reserve it for honor guards and ceremonial units. The goose step is very popular in Latin America, where it has been adopted by most Spanish-speaking countries. It is not found in countries where Dutch, English, or Portuguese is the official language. Goose stepping is found primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, areas that were in close proximity to Germany and Russia. Most African militaries trace their adoption of the goose step to the Cold War, when the communist countries supplied them with military aid and training. The German colonies used the goose step until World War I, when they were absorbed by the victorious Allies, but all of them restored the goose step after independence. Many militaries choose to use a high step in which the legs are lifted high off the ground, but the knee is bent at the top of the arc. The high step is commonly found in countries that abandoned the goose step, were under German military influence, or border countries that use the goose step. Countries that abandoned the goose step. Origin. Adoption outside Europe. Countries that were under German military influence. Argentina, the infantry company of the Colegio Militar de la Nación still uses the goose step as a parade step. However, several units of the Argentine Army and the Argentine Naval Prefecture that used to goose step have switched to the high step, which is also in standard use in the Argentine Navy and the Argentine Air Force. East Timor adopted the high step after obtaining its independence from Indonesia, which uses the goose step. Syrian government forces continue to goose step, but Kurdish forces have switched to the high step. Yugoslavia adopted the goose step shortly after World War II, as its army was modernized along Soviet lines. Goose stepping can be seen in the 1950 military parade in the capital Belgrade. However, it had been replaced by high stepping by the 1975 parade, as Marshal Tito asserted his independence from Soviet influence. High stepping is still used in Serbia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Cold War. Countries that use the goose step: Americas, Europe, Africa. Countries that border goose-stepping countries. During the Meiji era, the Japanese military was modernized along the German model, but the Imperial Japanese Army chose to adopt the high step instead of the goose step. The Japanese military dropped the high step after its defeat in World War II. Portugal adopted the high step in the 1910s, when it became a republic. Turkey's use of the high step dates back to the late Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman military was modernized under German influence. Like Japan, it chose to adopt a bent-leg high step instead of the German goose step. Turkey continues to use the high step today. The goose step is a ceremonial march that requires substantial training. It is often abandoned in times of war, as more pressing needs occupy the available training time. Opinion on the goose step was divided even in the German Wehrmacht in the 1930s. In the later part of World War II, the goose step nearly disappeared because of manpower shortages, accelerated courses in basic training, and a paucity of appropriate occasions. Brazil uses the high step as its general parade step. Brazil borders several Spanish-speaking countries that use the goose step. Somalia shares a border with Djibouti and sea borders with Yemen. The Somali Armed Forces and the Somaliland Armed Forces both perform the high step. Uruguay is one of the few Spanish-speaking countries that does not use the goose step. Instead, it uses the high step as its general parade step in all ceremonies. Lebanon shares borders with Syria to the north. The Lebanese armed forces today perform the high step in parades held on major national holidays. After the Second World War, West Germany abandoned the goose step in favor of a Western march step. East Germany preserved the goose step and renamed it the drilling step to avoid references to Old Prussian and Wehrmacht military traditions. The 200-year German tradition of goose stepping finally ended with German reunification in 1990, as East German forces were absorbed into the Bundeswehr and conformed to West German military customs. Although goose stepping has no official sanction, the practice is not illegal in Germany. Some civilian marching bands and riflemen's associations continue to goose step while others dropped it altogether. In Spartacus, a ballet by Aram Khachaturian, the Roman soldiers goose step in most of their scenes. English-speaking reviewers sometimes conclude erroneously that the choreography must be intending to link the Roman Empire with the tyranny of Nazi Germany. However, goose stepping in Russia carries no such connotation, and reflects only military discipline. Goose stepping can be found in a number of Russian ballets in which it is not associated with the villains. Middle East and Central Asia. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia abandoned the Russian-style goose step. The other 11 former Soviet republics have kept the goose step. Ethiopia adopted the goose step during the Derg military junta, which espoused socialist ideals and sought Soviet military aid. The practice was dropped after the Derg were overthrown. Hungary used the high step during the regency of Miklos Horthy, and switched to the goose step early in the Cold War. Neither march step was retained after the end of the Cold War, as the parade of 1961 formally ended its use in favor of the normal quick march. Italy introduced the goose step in 1938 under Benito Mussolini as the Passo Romano. The custom was never popular in Italy's armed forces except amongst the black shirts. The goose step was dropped after World War II. Romania used the goose step until from the 1910s up to 1967, when the Romanian armed forces ended using it for formal parades. It was briefly revived in the 1990s, and today only a single historical unit performs it while wearing First World War uniforms. Switzerland is a majority German-speaking country that absorbed many German military traditions alongside those of France and Italy. The Swiss armed forces abandoned the Goose Step in 1946, after the German defeat in World War II. The Republic of China armed forces continued to use the Goose Step after the end of the Chinese Civil War. The 80-year tradition of goose stepping was finally ended in 2003, during an independence-minded Democratic Progressive Party administration. In 2016, veterans organizations criticized the sloppy marching of military cadets and began holding their own goose-stepping parades, reviewed by Kuomintang politicians in 2 occasions. East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Zimbabwean guerrillas used the goose step during the Rhodesian Bush War of the 1970s. ZIPRA was trained and supplied by the Warsaw Pact, adopting East German uniforms and the goose step. Meanwhile, Zanla was supplied and trained by China in Maoist guerrilla tactics. However, Zimbabwe ultimately attained black majority rule thanks to British influence. As a result, the unified Zimbabwean army maintained a British march step. The goose step was ridiculed by Allied propaganda in the World Wars as a symbol of blind obedience and senseless attachment to military form. Prior to U.S. entry into World War I, American military observers had remarked favorably on the goose step as a means of building unit cohesion. However, its association with Nazi Germany in World War II proved fatal to the goose step's reputation in English-speaking countries. It was condemned in George Orwell's essay The Lion and the Unicorn, and proved an easy target for parody in many editorial cartoons and Hollywood films. High-stepping as an alternative. Orwell commented in England Your England that the goose step was used only in countries where the population was too scared to laugh at their military. In colloquial English, the phrase goose stepping has connotations of blind obedience and submission. The term does not carry this negative connotation in countries that actually use the goose step. This can result in mistaken interpretations due to cultural bias. Abandonment. Association with dictatorship. Cultural references.